Mulualele, Bula, Talofa Lava, and welcome to our MPI Risk Framework module. This is a presentation for the Pacific Island countries, in particular the ones that we've been in recent discussions with regarding our risk framework. I am Dr. Ryan Donovan. I am a Specialist Advisor from International Relations, and I will be taking you through this first module on our risk framework, particularly for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Just need to get it to work. There we go. So just the contents for today. First of all, we are going to cover off just a very brief introduction to the various speakers for the next lot of modules on risk analysis in particular. We're going to have some very basic information on MPI as a ministry within New Zealand and our particular roles and functions. We're going to have a bit of a talk about what some of the core risk analysis disciplines and capabilities are within MPI and outside of MPI, particularly the individuals that we utilise to develop our risk analysis framework. Could be our import house standards, policies and what have you. And finally, we will have a bit of a discussion about our risk framework itself with a real focus on our imported house standards as it relates to risk analysis. So I mentioned I'm Ryan Donovan from International Relations. I am a specialist in a number of different topics such as trade capability, our food chain. I'm a generalist when it comes to our risk analysis program. So we are going to hopefully, when further developing these modules for you all, bring the different specialists from the food safety space, from animal welfare, and from outside of the organisation or outside of the ministry, using other organisations such as ESR, which is the Institute of Environmental Science and Research, to discuss their part or the part that they play in the development of our risk analysis systems, and certainly other individuals as well, as we have need. So very quickly, just an overview of the Ministry for Primary Industries. Our primary goal or primary mission is to grow and protect New Zealand, and we do this first of all by maximising our export opportunities for all our primary industries, whether that be seafood, red meat, dairy, the forestry sector, but we also look to improve sector productivity. We do have a significant focus and an increasing focus on our sustainable resource use, and ensuring we are meeting sustainable system or sustainable requirements when developing our primary industry policy and standards, and obviously protecting New Zealand from biological risk, which is a really key part in our MPI vision. If we can't protect, then we're not going to grow efficiently. So our four major systems, we function across biosecurity, food safety, primary production systems, and our trade. And obviously our risk analysis framework or risk framework touches on every single one of those aspects. But our two main risk analysis departments per se relate to our animal health and food safety systems. So we have two separate directorates, food safety and animal health, where we have a variety of science disciplines and different individuals working on our risk framework or risk analysis program. Just some examples of our core risk analysis capabilities itself within MPI in particular. In our food safety directorate, we have microbiologists, toxicologists, food scientists, and epidemiologists and veterinarians that spend a significant amount of their time doing research and developing strategies around managing our risk, for the likes of developing codes of practice, developing policy legislation. We also see the same in the Animal Health Directorate, where we have a significant number of epidemiologists and veterinarians who are developing pathways for the importation of commodities within New Zealand, and understanding those pathways for developing risk assessment strategies and developing those activities within the risk analysis program. Excuse me. Other capabilities that we certainly call upon, or they are part and parcel of our risk analysis framework, or are our risk analysis or our risk assessors. We have risk managers. We have those that are either qualified in statistics, or we look to bring in statisticians where required for our quantitative assessments. We also bring in others as required. We might have specific capabilities in the social policy space that are important for understanding the different options for managing significant risks and ensuring that our management options are aligned with our broader government objectives. I've noted down the bottom of this slide that most of our risk analysts also have epidemiology or training education. So the first question we just want to answer, or at least cover off in this webinar, is answering the question, what is risk? So the risk definition we have applied is similar to what you would find the likes of the OIE, where the risk is the likelihood of an adverse occurrence and the likely magnitude of the consequence of the occurrence. We've got a wonderful picture on the right hand side of this slide of what a typical modern day example in the transport space might actually look like. What is the likelihood of an adverse occurrence taking place when you step into the car and go for a drive? And what is the likely magnitude of the consequences of crashing? And obviously this is a really good example because risks can be quite diverse, but the consequence can be quite diverse as well. And this is where the process actually needs to be robust, and where we look to develop various options for managing those risks. So what is risk analysis? Risk analysis is the assessment, the management, and the communication of that risk. And we've just put a few key questions in the slide that looks to answer. When looking at a risk analysis, you're looking to answer the following questions. What can go wrong? How likely is it to go wrong? How serious would it be if it did go wrong? And what can we do to reduce the likelihood of the seriousness of it going wrong? Now, when we come to talk about our risk framework, for the purpose of this training or this module, risk analysis and our risk framework can be considered interchangeable or the equivalent. There are some subtle differences, but generally when we talk about our risk framework, we capture all those activities, the processes, the programs that do take place when looking at risk analysis itself. Now, when we look at MPI's risk framework, first of all, I just want to put a disclaimer here that our MPI risk framework, or what we generally call our risk management framework, but for the sake of this module, we'll call it the risk framework. Our risk framework is currently under review and will look to be updated in due course. So the risk framework is essentially a set of components that provide the foundations and the organisational arrangements for designing, implementing, monitoring, reviewing and continually improving our risk management. There are 7 elements of MPI's risk management process, which is outlined in the policy itself. This process is closely aligned to one of the New Zealand Australian ISO accreditation standards, what we call ISO 31000, and it simply utilises best practice risk management methodology. And this is as follows. Number 1, we look to identify the issue and the context that we are trying to understand. We establish the evidence base. This is about gathering as much information as you can about a particular risk, whether it be the characteristics of the organism itself or the environment that we are looking to develop a risk strategy on. Number 3, we look to identify risk management options, and it's really important that we do provide a variety of options based on the level of risk associated with a particular organism, This allows the risk managers to have as much information as they can and to make decisions based on international norms or government policy as a whole. We then make the risk management decision. This is about implementing it, and alongside that we look to implement not just the risk management decision, but we look to monitor and evaluate the decisions that we have made. Now the process of that involves risk communication at every part of the process. This is communicating the risk or the activities involved with the risk analysis, both internally in MPI, but also with our stakeholders and other government agencies that may be interested or having a particular part to play when developing the risk analysis. This also includes our international stakeholders where relevant. This is particularly where there is a level of expertise present internationally, or where we know our trading partners might be undertaking similar risk analysis for a particular organism or a commodity. And we look to align our systems or our processes, certainly the information that we are gathering. And just that final point, monitoring and evaluate, that allows us to ensure that the decisions we have made in our risk analysis space are able to be amended if we find that the reality of implementing the risk management decisions are not fully in line with our expectations. Next, we want to point out that all our policy regarding our risk analysis are all internationally aligned. So we know that the World Trade Organization has developed a sanitary phytosanitary agreement, and under that particular agreement, we have three key groups that look to further develop guidance or international norms, particularly those that are rules-based, whether it be for food safety, animal health, or for plant health. So the policies we are developing under a risk framework ensure that they are internationally aligned with those expectations. For our food safety program, we ensure that our policies are aligned with Codex, and we've got two principal pieces of legislation called our Food Act and the Animal Products Act that fully incorporate those Codex requirements. But we also have our animal health and biosecurity requirements in line with the OIE, or what we call the World Organization for Animal Health. The OIE does have extensive information relating to the import risk analysis process, and all our training modules, all our programs are closely aligned with OIE guidelines. So in this slide we will be looking at MPI's import risk analysis protocol to discuss how a risk framework operates in practice. We are going to be covering this off in more detail in future modules, so this is just a very general and brief overview. First of all, we want to have a look at the hazard identification. So the first thing that we ask when we are looking at the particular hazard in question, and we could be looking at the likes of Listeria monocytogenes within an imported ready-to-eat product. So some of the questions we ask, first of all, is the organism likely to be associated with the commodity? If the commodity is a ready-to-eat product, is Listeria monocytogenes likely to be associated with that particular commodity? Is the organism actually present in the importing country? That helps us determine very quickly whether or not a risk assessment needs to take place. Is there a control program in the importing country itself? Are there different strains overseas? And we know that there are different types or different strains of Listeria monocytogenes, and we want to see, for example, whether or not the particular Listeria monocytogenes strain from the country that we're looking to import the product from is of a greater level of pathogenicity, for example, than what we actually have here in New Zealand. Next question, is the organism identified as a hazard? And again, this all helps us to determine whether or not we actually need to undertake a risk assessment itself. The next part of the import risk analysis is undertaking a risk assessment, and probably one of the most important but one of the most complicated processes in the import risk analysis. So a risk assessment essentially is the process of estimating the likelihood and the biological and economic consequences of the entry, the establishment or the spread of a particular hazard within the territory of an importing country. And it consists of 4 very interrelated steps. Hopefully it should pop up. There we go. First of all, the entry assessment. So this determines the likelihood of an importing commodity being infected or contaminated with a hazard, and it describes the biological pathway or pathways necessary for that hazard to be introduced into a particular environment. So if we look at our Listeria monocytogenes example, we will look to describe the type of commodity and how that particular Listeria monocytogenes strain can actually be introduced into the New Zealand environment if we were looking to New Zealand as an example. The second part of the process is what we call an exposure assessment. And this describes the biological pathway or pathways necessary for the exposure of animals and humans in the importing countries, such as New Zealand, to the particular hazards identified. And it estimates the likelihood of those exposures occurring. So again, using our Listeria monocytogenes example, we'd say what is the likelihood of that Listeria monocytogenes strain being present in the ready-to-eat product and actually enabling exposure to animals or humans consuming that product. The third activity in the risk assessment process is what we call a consequence assessment. And this essentially describes the relationship between the exposure to the hazard, the consequences of those exposures, and their likelihood. The fourth and final activity within the risk analysis process, or within the risk assessment process, is it asks the question, is the organism assessed to be a risk overall? And essentially integrates all the results from the entry assessment, the exposure assessment, and the consequence assessment to produce a summary measure of the risks identified with or associated with the identified hazard. The risk assessor and the risk managers will then use that information to provide scientific advice on potential threats associated with that hazard, and the managers will use this advice as a basis for making decisions, along with other decisions that have been provided to the manager to address those particular issues. So just finally, as we mentioned before, with the risk management side of things, the risk manager looks at the different options that are available to manage the risk, and they looked at the effect of each measure alone or in combination on the level of risk, and they make decisions for managing that risk based on the effect of those individual measures or the combination of the types of measures that could be implemented. So again, just to recap on what we have just discussed, and here is an overview diagram or flow diagram of the risk analysis process. We did discuss about the hazard identification and the different types of things you look at with the hazard identification and determine if the organism itself actually is a hazard, after which you would undertake a risk assessment if the organism was a hazard. We talked about the entry assessment, the exposure or the establishment assessment, and then we covered off the consequence assessment and the risk estimation. This particular diagram, or this flow diagram, is found in the OAE Import Risk Analysis Handbook. So you'll find this on the website, and a very, very useful diagram to have handy to help continue to drive or develop your import risk analysis process. Make sure this works. So we talked about the 4 components of the risk assessment. I'm not going to go through these again in too much detail, but we look at the probability of the entry, With the probability of the entry, I'll just quickly note that when we do a pathway development, there are a number of criteria that we look at when looking at the pathway, and this is where our epidemiologists become so incredibly handy, is where they can sit down and look at the particular hazard, and they can look at the pathways for the entry and the establishments of the particular organism in question. So here is an example of a very generic pathway categories in terms of where the particular organism can enter into New Zealand, on what type of container, packaging material, what kind of commodity, and it provides some various examples of the types of things that you need to look at when undertaking your risk assessment as to how the organism in general can enter into your country. So we've got three key types of pathways here, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on some of these. First one is transportation related pathways. So this looks at all your different modes of transportation, your truck versus your sea freight versus your air freight. They look at the types of risks that those particular transportation methods can provide when you are moving the commodity in which your organism might be present. We looked at those living industry pathways, so the type of pathways for a plant or a food, such as transporting animals for consumption or not for consumption, or for non-consumption purposes such as rendering or pet food, and non-living animal and plant-related pathways for animals and plants. And finally, we have our miscellaneous pathways. That could, an example could be, and we've put there biocontrol, where you have a particular organism that you might be importing into your country to control a particular pest or disease, and you're asking the question whether or not that biocontrol itself is actually harbouring another type of organism that could be considered a hazard and therefore a potential risk within your importing country. So here is a broader example of the transportation related pathways. So these are the kind of assessments when you're looking at the hazard and the risk assessment itself. This is how deep into the pathway of the development you need to go to have a look at the types of material, the types of commodity that the organism can actually enter into your country on, and you can assess whether or not those pathways are relevant, and if they are relevant, assessing them further in terms of what likelihood or probability that the organism would be present within the commodity on that particular pathway. This is a transportation related pathway as mentioned. Then we have a living industry pathway. A really good example of a piece of work that we are doing at the moment is the L2.1 on the diagram, live seafood. So we know that live seafood can either be used for edible, for human consumption, or animal consumption, things such as bait. If it is present as bait, what kind of organisms may be present on that particular commodity that could then pose a risk to our waterways if it is bringing in an organism used as bait and has the opportunity to spread. So that's the kind of pathway assessment that a number of our aquatic specialists are doing at the moment regarding the importation of bait and seafood for human consumption. And then obviously the miscellaneous pathways, again going into more detail on that. So these are just some examples of the commodities and the pathways that product can be imported. If you're importing fresh kiwi fruit, there is the possibility that it might be harbouring a pest or a disease that has the opportunity or the potential to spread within an importing country. A dairy cow or a beef cow, you have to consider the entire ecosystem per se of the animal itself to look at the kinds of risks that may be present. For example, parasite control, mites, ticks, internal parasites, and what kind of organisms may be transported within the animal as well as on the animal that may need to be considered when imposing or considering biosecurity protocols for the importation of that particular animal. We talked earlier on about Listeria monocytogenes. So we talk about ready-to-eat products. The two examples we have on this slide, red meat and honey, we would obviously look at that and look at the intended purpose of that particular piece of meat or that particular honey, and say number one, is the intended purpose of that commodity to be cooked or eaten raw? If it is there an opportunity for that particular organism, such as Listeria monocytogenes, to grow and to be considered a hazard and therefore a risk with the consumption of that product? And I've got a couple of more examples here. Number one, the container. The container itself can harbour a significant number of organisms. We talk about brown marmorated stink bug. We talk about exotic ants and other pests and diseases that need to be considered with the importation of the product. And we go through all the process. We're not going to cover off exposure or consequence assessment any further in this module, but we'll just briefly mention the risk estimation. So with the risk estimation, you're essentially taking all the probabilities of the risk assessment in terms of the entry, the exposure and the consequence, and you are providing that into a risk estimation matrix, and this allows the risk assessor as well as the risk manager to look at the likelihood or the qualitative assessment, if you like, of the particular organism itself, and whether or not the options that you're developing for managing those risks, if any, need to be small or significant in nature. So we've gone from the very insignificant in the diagram, where you are unlikely to impose management of the risk management options, right through to the extreme, where there's an almost very certain likelihood of that organism producing any given consequence, and what kind of consequence it's going to be if it's a major. We're looking at the extremity of that, and you will therefore use that to determine whether or not the options that you have are going to be suitable if you're wanting to import the product, or whether or not there is just a blanket ban on that particular product if the consequences are so extreme, and the ability to manage those risks in the exporting country are not going to be sufficient to effectively minimise the opportunity for that organism to get into the importing country. But we will talk about that again at a later module. So I just want to say thank you for looking and listening to this first module. Malo vinaka whaawhiti, if I said that right. And thank you again, and we will look to produce the next module within the next 3 or 4 weeks.